Demon's Souls is a 2009 action role-playing game for the PlayStation 3. It was developed by From Software and published by Sony, Atlus, and Namco Bandai. Set in the dark fantasy world, players take control of a hero who has journeyed to the fictional kingdom of Boletaria, which is being ravaged by a cursed fog that brings forth demons who feast on the souls of mortals. So let's just get straight into the game and slay some demons. So like many RPGs, there's character customization with name, gender, class, and appearance selection. The name doesn't really affect anything in the game. It's more so to differentiate the character and profile selection than anything else. Gender selection may not seem relevant to gameplay at first, but it is actually somewhat important. Certain items and equipment in the game can only be used by one gender and not the other. Meanwhile, the class selection is actually not as important as other RPGs. It is definitely a considerable choice for a new player as it affects the immediate starting equipment, but there's no need to stress over it, and I'll explain why. So usually in games that have a class system, those classes are made as a frame of specialization in which the character works within. This is not really the case in Demon's Souls, as it's more of an origin selection than a class selection. The only things that the class affects are starting equipment and starting stats. Notice the key word, starting. Both the character's stats and equipment can be changed throughout the game. In fact, that's the entire point of character progression in the first place, so I would recommend to a new player to just pick whatever class seems cool or fun, since the character can more or less be shaped into whatever later on. And finally, there's the character's appearance, which is purely cosmetic, and it's what you'd expect from face customization in a 2000s game. You can pretty much only make the character look like a potato at various temperatures. So the game starts out in a tutorial area which teaches the controls through developer messages laid out on the ground. Basically, they show the controls for a certain mechanic and then present an opportunity to put it to use. I like how this tutorial doesn't force me to perform an action before letting me proceed. I can go through it at my own pace and not worry about a bunch of menus blocking me from playing the game. Demon's Souls has a real-time combat system that allows locking onto enemies to attack, defend, or evade them. The first combat encounters show very early on that timing is essential to success. I can't just haphazardly attack and expect to win. Enemies are very reactive to my actions, and so I'll have to be reactive to theirs. Not being attentive in combat is a guaranteed way to die. The game is very punishing in that regard. I find an Archstone, which teleports to specific locations in the world. This one only leads to the second area of the tutorial though, so I'll talk more about them later. I also find some glowing objects. They're scavengeable items around the level that can also drop from fallen enemies. Most of the items here in the tutorial are moon grasses, which are the game's healing items. 5 different items can be put in quick use slots to use while in combat. Other items like weapons and armor can be equipped as well. There's an armor slot for the head, torso, hands, and legs, as well as 2 weapon slots for each hand that can be shuffled between. 2 ammunition slots, one for arrows and one for bolts. And finally, 2 slots for rings, which have unique properties that enhance, alter, or grant certain abilities in one way or another. It's important to note that equipment weight and inventory weight are 2 separate values, and movement speed is determined only by what is currently equipped. That being said, there is an inventory burden limit as well that I find to be extremely annoying, and I'll talk more about that later. So past the fog wall at the end of the tutorial, the first boss fight, the Vanguard, is introduced. Demon's Souls has a heavy focus on boss fights. There are many of them throughout the entire game, usually acting as a bookend for a certain level. In this specific case, the player is pretty underleveled, and so a new player will probably die pretty quickly. It is possible to defeat him though. It's basically a matter of having to strafe around him and avoid his butt slam. If the Vanguard is defeated, then there's another Archstone that leads to an unknown area with a bunch of goodies laying around as a reward. Then this giant dragon with 6-pack abs smashes my character's face in and kills me instantly in a forced cutscene. It's kinda cheap that the game forces death through a cutscene here, especially when it's so different than how the rest of the game plays. Either way, death is inevitable at the end of the tutorial. After dying, you wake up with your soul trapped in the Nexus, sort of a hub world that the rest of the game is staged from. The Nexus is home to many non-hostile friendly NPCs, some of which act as item vendors or spell teachers. A place to take a break from the rest of the game, stock up on various items, upgrade equipment, and level up. On the first arrival to the Nexus, one of the NPCs suggests trying one of the Archstones in the search for demon souls. The 5 Archstones allow travel to 5 different worlds infested with demons. From here, progression through the game varies. Each world contains a few areas to progress through, and each world can be tackled in somewhat any order, always being able to return to the Nexus and try going through another area at any time. But for the sake of structure, I'll talk about these worlds one at a time, and touch on different aspects of the game as I go along. The first Archstone leads to the Boletarian Palace, a huge castle fortress inhabited by the king's men and subjects who have gone mad and attacked people on sight. It's also home to a couple dragons that have nested nearby and use the area as a hunting and feeding ground. The first section involves going through the outer walls of the Boletarian Palace. Enemies hide in ambush behind barricades and around corners. Right off the bat, the game is teaching me the best way to traverse a level, methodically and with thought and consideration into every move. Situational awareness is crucial in Demon Souls. Not having it will likely lead to being caught in a horrible situation. Enemies have little regard for the player's well-being, and are likely to attack without any remorse. I say that because combat in a lot of games restrict enemies from ganging up on the player. Think about Assassin's Creed and how there are groups of enemies surrounding the player, but they decide to just wait their turns before attacking. Combat in Demon Souls doesn't operate like that. The enemies are placed around a level for the player to encounter and deal with whatever tools they have at their disposal. So paying attention to the environment and the enemies is necessary to survival. Dying in Demon Souls can be exceptionally unforgiving. Pausing the game is not possible without quitting out, and upon death, all accumulated souls are lost, and the player is sent back to the last Archstone with all the enemies respawned. There is also a switch from body form to soul form, which halves the health bar. Sounds tough, but there is a silver lining. There is one chance to go back and retrieve the souls from a bloodstain before a second death where they are lost forever. And it's important to do that, as souls are the primary currency used for purchasing items and level ups. They're gained simply by killing enemies. Another part of the silver lining is how the game's save system works. Upon death, the game isn't reverted back to an earlier save state. The player is just simply transported back. This means that items obtained in previous gameplay are kept, but also that the one-time use items spent during the previous run are lost forever. This allows for many strategies like doing suicide runs to a specific place where an item is, getting it, then dying and being sent back to the beginning of the level. Except of course the item is kept and can be used now. A lot of players with prior knowledge will use this strategy to gain an edge early in the game. Until the first boss is defeated, this area is the only one that can be visited. The first level mostly consists of fighting peasants and soldiers that have gone mad and attack on sight. They are mostly easy in a one-on-one fight, but a lot of them are hiding in corners, waiting in ambush, and others have set up traps like falling boulders, or attack from range with crossbows and bombs. As I said, being situationally aware at all times will help out a lot. There are also some soldiers with spears and shields, who will hide behind their shields and stab from range, that need to be maneuvered around or have their guards broken. Then there are knights with glowing blue eyes who hit hard and have a shield with a lot of armor. Be careful with these guys as their attacks are very punishing. Between all the soldiers and knights with shields, I think the game is trying to incentivize mastering the backstab mechanic. An attack directly on an opponent's back will lock into a backstab animation that deals tons of damage to the enemy. This mechanic is extremely useful, especially towards the Red Eye Knights. The Red Eye Knights are a huge pain in the early game, and they'll do a ton of damage in a single hit. But for now, there's only one of them, and he's an optional fight. He's guarding a door that can be unlocked later in the game. That's something that will be encountered on some levels. An enemy might be too difficult in the present, or a path might be blocked off, and the best option is to return later to finish it with more experience. Sort of like these two nesting dragons. In the first level, they kinda just hang out there and don't stand too much in the way, aside from doing bombing runs on the locals. And not all the locals are hostile. A lot of times there are friendly or neutral characters to meet that are hanging out in each level. They won't instantly attack on sight like most others, and often have a bit of dialogue as well. And these aren't just random NPCs. Most of them have these sort of mini quest lines to complete a series of tasks for them, for some sort of reward. But of course, it's possible to just murder them on the spot and take their stuff. I guess this is where I should talk about the game's tendency system. There is world tendency and character tendency. World tendency has events which affect the world as a whole, while character tendency has its own effects more specially involved with the character himself. Sort of like an alignment or karma system, with some pros or cons for having it high or low. As an example, killing some friendly characters will lower the tendency towards black, which makes the game harder, but has some other separate benefits. On the other hand, defeating a level's boss, for example, will increase the tendency towards white, making the game easier but coming with its own downsides as well, like enemies dropping fewer upgrade stones. Honestly, it's pretty convoluted, but it does make the game pretty dynamic in the way the world reacts to the player's actions. You can actually go back to different levels with a different tendency level and find new things like different paths, items, and characters have been unlocked. Tendency is also tied into the game's multiplayer mechanics, but I'll talk more about them later in the video. Eventually, it's time to face the first proper boss fight in the game, the Phalanx. The Phalanx is just a giant gooey blob, but it's surrounded by a bunch of smaller blobs that have huge shields and long spears. They amass together and form a shield wall around the main blob that has to be defeated. It moves slowly around the room while shedding these smaller hoplite blobs that try to circle around and envelop the player, poking with their huge spears and also chucking them from range. I think the skills learned in the level actually come into play here. Mastering the backstab mechanic against the shielded soldiers and knights surely plays into outmaneuvering the hoplites, dispatching them, and also attacking the unarmored parts of the Phalanx's formation. After defeating a boss, a large amount of souls are gained. Even the demon's own souls, some of which are capable of being turned into unique weapons that reflect the boss's traits. And also, as another reward, the soul form is reverted back into the body form, which restores the entire health bar. Of course, dying again will cause the body form to be lost again. Although it is possible to regain body form again at any time with the use of stones of ephemeral eyes, of which there are a limited supply. An archstone also appears in the boss arena, serving as the beginning of the next level in the world. Using any archstone in the world leads back to the Nexus. And this second visit introduces the Maiden in Black, a character that unlocks the ability to level up by using souls to increase stats. The 8 stats consist of Vitality, Intelligence, and Endurance, which increase health, mana, and stamina respectively, among other benefits like equipment, spell, and inventory carrying capacity. Next are Strength and Dexterity, which increase damage output with melee weapons. Check a weapon's description to see the amount of strength and dexterity they require to wield, and also how well each of those stats increase the damage bonus with them. Next are Magic and Faith, which increase damage output with magic spells and miracles. Finally, there is Luck, which increases item drop rates across the board. A lot of people consider luck to be the useless stat in this game, and I tend to agree. Increasing any stat by 1 costs an amount of souls and raises the character's overall soul level by 1 point as well. And with each subsequent level up, the amount of souls needed to level up again increases. So now the rest of the worlds are unlocked and can be explored in mostly any order, barring a couple exceptions. But again, for the sake of structure, I'll talk about these worlds one at a time. So for now, I'll head back to the Boletarian Palace. The second level of the Boletarian Palace consists of a very long bridge full of enemies that lead toward another boss. The entire bridge is guarded by one of the dragons who swoops down and incinerates the area with bombing runs. Hanging out in the open on the bridge is a surefire way to get burnt to a crisp. There's also these guard stations that lead upwards to a vantage point and downwards into an area on the underside of the bridge. Be careful down here because there's a pack of dogs and they're pretty fast and aggressive, though their barks echo through the tunnels, so they're somewhat telegraphed. As soon as I heard them, I knew I was gonna have to put down some pooches. As the player progresses through the game, the world has sort of a progression it goes through as well. For example, a couple characters from the first level reappear here to continue their quest lines. This sort of thing happens frequently, and it gives the game a cool feeling as the characters are progressing through the world just as the player does. Sort of like we're all in this arduous journey together. That concept is also reflected in the game's multiplayer mechanics, which I will get to eventually. So after running across the huge bridge and dodging the dragons comes this level's boss fight, the Tower Knight. The Tower Knight is a gigantic knight in metallic armor wielding a big tower shield and a long lance. He will stab and swing with his lance from behind his shield, with some pretty devastating attacks, one of which has him smashing his shield on the ground for a massive AoE attack that is best avoided. The whole boss room is full of archers shooting from above, and having to quickly run around the map and take them all out while the Tower Knight is shooting explosive magic arrows at you is pretty insane. Attacking the Tower Knight conventionally is pretty futile as his heavy armor and shield can't be broken through. The way to defeat him is to sprint behind his guard and hit his weak spots at his ankles, which send him toppling down, leaving his head exposed to attack for considerable damage before he gets back up again. After a few rotations of that, he's eventually defeated. And so this is actually as far as I can go in the Boletarian Palace for now, at least until a final final boss of one of the other worlds is defeated. So let's go to those other worlds. The second archstone in the Nexus leads to Stonefang Tunnel, a huge mining operation with lots of rocks, smoke, and lava. The first level here is inhabited by these scaly miners who are resistant to slashing or crushing damage. Some of them are carrying around a huge bag of stones that are used to upgrade weapons. They're weak to thrusting and piercing attacks, so having a rapier or a spear to deal with them is very helpful, or just use any stab attack your weapon might have. I suppose it's a good time to talk about the different weapon movesets now. So there's a light, heavy, rolling, backstepping, and running attack. Each have their own animations, timing, and hitbox. Knowing which to use in a given situation and what a specific weapon's move is for each attack is extremely useful, especially since each weapon type has their own unique set of moves, otherwise known as a moveset. In this specific instance, it's useful to have a weapon that has a thrusting or piercing attack in its moveset, which can be found out when looking at it in the inventory or just trying it out. Finding a weapon that fits your playstyle is an essential part of gameplay in the Souls games. This level also has some dogs and a lot of fire lizards, but the thing to worry more about are these fat officials that shoot fireballs from range. There's also another vendor and blacksmith to find here. This blacksmith can upgrade weapons further, even to turn them into boss weapons like I mentioned earlier. He can also apply special properties to them like fire or magic damage, using special upgrade stones that are found throughout the game. Some even change the weapon to have a different damage scaling, like when making a magic based character for example, and investing a lot into magic, being able to alter a weapon to scale with magic instead of strength or dexterity is a pretty good feature. The boss for this level is the Armor Spider, which is, well, a giant armored spider. The fight starts at the back of this long tunnel on the way towards the spider as he shoots webs and fireballs down through it. This part is really intense actually. Getting to him is a challenge in itself as his webs impede movement, making his fireballs hard to avoid. And once the tunnel is tackled, he has some really damaging attacks up close as well. This fight really just tests the player's adaptability towards a given situation, and also when the given situation is rapidly changing. In particular, the Armored Spider really highlighted to me the need to have some sort of option to deal ranged damage, and also fight against the ranged damage. And it showed me the importance of all those extra consumable items and spells that buff up weapons with this secondary damage property. They're really useful when going up against armored opponents. We're really deep into the mining structure now, basically in the raw underground earth with dangerous creatures and environmental hazards like lava. There are these rock bugs that soak up a ton of damage, coming in several variants ranging from flying to giant. There's these rockworms that burrow into the ground and pop out to attack when they sense movement. There's also some phantom enemies which are usually humanoid and wield various equipment found in the game. They're also called Black Phantoms, a special enemy type that is usually stronger and much more dangerous than normal enemies. While they're called Black Phantoms, they actually have a noticeably red outline. Black Phantoms can actually be other players who have invaded the world to fight in player versus player combat. Engaging in multiplayer in Demon's Souls can be done in a few different ways. The most basic way is through messages. Messages can be laid out on the ground and appear in other people's worlds. Messages can be used to give tips to other players out of pre-made message templates. For example, leaving or reading a message saying "be wary of trap ahead" to help out other players. Of course, tricking other players is just as well possible by straight up lying, like suggesting they should jump off a ledge as if there's some sort of secret treasure below. Bloodstains of other players can also be found, but instead of collecting their souls, allows you to see a ghost of them in their final moments before death. This is a useful way of seeing what dangers lie ahead before tackling them. Sometimes ghosts of other players hanging out in their world can also be seen. Different colored stones can also be used to enter into another player's world, as either a friendly phantom to co-op or an enemy phantom for PvP. Items can be dropped and traded with other players, and the set of emotes can be exchanged to communicate. There aren't any text or voice chats in multiplayer, so emotes are pretty much the only way to communicate. Now I haven't actually shown any footage of this. That's because the Demon's Souls multiplayer servers on PS3 were shut down in February of 2018, and I'm also playing on an emulated version of the game, so there's no way of me being able to show off anything about the multiplayer. However, mostly all of these multiplayer features carry over into Demon's Souls' spiritual successor Dark Souls, so I've been showing footage of that instead. So this area is mostly regarded as the area to farm upgrade materials, but I actually find it noteworthy for its sense of verticality, descending further and further down into the earth, jumping down from ledges, traversing tunnels, and carefully managing resources while being stuck in this underground labyrinth. The reason I like it so much is more because of the boss fight though, the Flame Lurker. Flame Lurker is trapped deep inside Stonefang Tunnel, a huge fire demon surrounded in an area filled with dragon bones. He's a hulking humanoid enemy, completely shrouded in fire, but he behaves more like an animal, lashing out with his huge claws or smashing with his fists. His behavior is actually really interesting. I've noticed that if I try to run away from him, he quickly chases after me, much like an animal predator would. I'm not sure if this was deliberate by design or not, but it's an awesome touch. He has a really cool aesthetic with his entire body shrouded in fire, and the fight is in this huge arena in what looks like a ruin of an underground civilization. Flame Lurker is one of the tougher bosses in the game, and is sure to test the player's raw skill with reaction time, spacing, and dodging. But since he's a huge step up in difficulty, some players might have to go complete other levels and come back to him after gaining more experience. All in all, Flame Lurker is one of my favorite fights in the entire game, and I know it is for many others as well. Right after beating Flame Lurker, there's a fog wall that immediately starts another boss fight, this time against the Dragon God, the one that planted its fist in me in the beginning of the game. And it's a surprisingly easy fight, especially after Flame Lurker, because there isn't an actual fight against it. Instead, there's a couple ballistas to run around to and shoot him to death with. He tries to attack by punching, but it's pitifully easy to dodge. This fight is actually more of a puzzle than an actual battle, except it's a puzzle that requires no thinking, so it's more of a test of movement? I don't know. Honestly, this boss is very underwhelming. The game hinted at fighting this behemoth of the dragon after seeing him in the beginning of the game. Maybe climbing on his back or something like in Shadow of the Colossus. But no, I guess he's just there for a cheap spectacle. Oh well. There's a cool sword in his arena and a few crystal lizards. But crystal lizards are everywhere in the game. They drop upgrade materials after you kill them. Overall, the Dragon God is a big disappointment, especially after the great fight with the Flame Lurker. They could have done so much better here. The third Archstone leads to the Tower of Latria, a really creepy and atmospheric world with some pretty cool horror elements and some really vicious enemies. The world starts out in a multi-floor prison, full of cells with crazy prisoners and guarded over by these extremely dangerous Cthulhu head enemies called Mind Flayers. They patrol around the various levels with little bells and have absolutely devastating attacks. At close range, they'll shoot a ball of paralyzing energy so they can grapple and stab with their tentacles. And on top of that, they'll emit an AoE blast. And finally, at long range, they'll cast a really fast and powerful magic dart over and over. These guys are always a looming presence in the level and are a very real threat, more so than most other enemies in the game. There are various valuables to loot off prisoners dead and alive, and various doors and cells to unlock with keys scavenged throughout the level. There are a couple friendly NPCs to find, a few spooks that jump out, and many items to scavenge. There's almost no moongrass drops in this place, so be really careful with resource management. After exploring the prison, it leads out into another area with some pretty impressive scale. There's a giant cathedral in the distance to head towards, the path to which is being guarded by a giant statue that shoots a million arrows out in front of it. After navigating around it to disable it, there's a long staircase up to the cathedral that's guarded by a black phantom. This one is a thief character that does a massive amount of damage with her crossbow. I suppose this is a good opportunity to talk about a couple interesting combat mechanics. And honestly, I'm impressed with myself that I managed to get this far in the video without talking about them. So what I do right here is called a parry. With correct timing, parrying an opponent's attack will subsequently leave them vulnerable to a riposte. A riposte is a critical attack similar to a backstab that deals a lot of damage. It's a great risk and reward mechanic since the timing has to be perfect to pull it off. If the timing is missed, the punishment is taking unnecessary damage. After my successful parry and riposte here, I two-hand my weapon. Two-handing a weapon allows it to deal extra damage, but whatever is equipped in the left hand is no longer usable, be it a shield or a catalyst. This is more of an offensive mode, but is also useful in that it changes the weapon's moveset as well. A light attack one-handed might do a horizontal slash, but two-handed it might do a vertical slash. That alone is really useful as some enemies could be above or below a horizontal slash's hitbox. I really like this as an option as it allows players to excel in the more aggressive playstyle and be rewarded for it. Alright, so it's time to talk about the next boss located inside the cathedral, the Fool's Idol. Fool's Idol is actually a rather relaxed boss fight in the context of the rest of the fights in the game. She's not actively engaged in pursuing the player in combat like most other bosses. She's instead more on the defense, dishing out different illusory spells to impede progress. She can place these paralysis traps all over the boss room, which become invisible immediately after their placement. Pay attention to where they are placed in the beginning and quickly memorize their location to avoid being caught in them. She shoots big magic rays that are easy to avoid unless stuck in one of the paralysis traps. She can also teleport around the room and create duplicates of herself that serve to distract and obscure, which is the real one. And while trying to figure out which one is the real boss, the player can get stuck in one of the paralysis traps and get annihilated by a barrage of magic. There's a dude on the top floor that heals this boss as well. He can actually be navigated to prior to entering the fog wall and killed. Overall, not a super hard fight in terms of combat, but I do find it fun as sort of a memorization and navigation puzzle. So after defeating the Fool's Idol, some church bells ring and you get carried up to the next level by some gargoyles, ending up in a really high up area, full of narrow bridges that interconnect with different buildings. This area carries over the really great atmosphere from the prison as well, and even takes it up a notch. There's like this constant heart pumping sound that's really anxiety inducing, and I really like the architecture in this level in general, especially how the gargoyle enemies sit up in their perches before they swoop down and attack. The whole level is pretty dark and these guys like to hide in the shadows. They have long rapiers and crossbows that they use to stab and shoot from range. Now there is a really weird issue I found with these guys in that their AI while flying behaves really erratically. The animation of them flying is also just really lame as well. Like they'll be flapping their wings normally 1 second, and then the next they're just gliding through the air motionless. When they land they look really tall and menacing, but they are actually pretty easy to take down. It's more about them catching the player off guard while trying to navigate the bridges, which when fallen from will result in plummeting to the dark depths below. After the bridges and going up some spiral staircases and lifts, there are these cages that can be ridden way down to the bottom of the level and back up again. There's a pretty important NPC here to meet named Yurt the Silent Chief, though at first he just seems like a really creepy dude in some nice armor. When the cage lifts are rode down to the bottom, they end up in this really disgusting swamp full of blood, and there's also some pretty disgusting looking centipede guys infesting the area here. They're pretty easy alone, but can be dangerous in groups. After slowly making our way back up to the central building, there's some more mind flayers, this time as black phantoms and even more dangerous than before. This whole level is pretty long and takes place in a couple really interesting and tough areas, which means there's a lot of chances to die and be sent all the way to the back of the beginning of the level on the bridges. There are some shortcuts, but it's still somewhat of a struggle getting to the end. A huge part of Demon's Souls' difficulty comes from the path leading to the boss rather than the actual boss itself. There's one archstone for each boss, meaning there aren't any checkpoints between the beginning of the area to the boss fight. That's a significant punishment that comes along with dying in this game. A save can't just be made right outside a boss, and you can't just keep trying multiple times in a row. Every time the player dies, they have to navigate through the challenges of the level once again. And believe me when I say a lot of the levels are designed in a way that punishes the player for trying to rush to the boss fight. Of course it can be done, but only with enough skill that the player would be able to move through the level normally anyway. Opening a couple paths unlocks the next boss, the Man-Eater. The Man-Eater is an even bigger and more threatening gargoyle that is much more of a challenge than the regular gargoyle enemies. He'll fly around like the other gargoyles, but he can also cast magic and attack while flying. And when he lands on the narrow platform, he'll cause a lot of pain with his fists and tail. He even has a really strong pounce attack that just flattens anything in his way, as well as a sonic AoE attack similar to the Mind Flayers. He's pretty tough but manageable. If the Flame Lurker was defeated by this point, then the Man-Eater won't seem too difficult in comparison. That is until a second Man-Eater enters the fight and they form a tag team. Fighting just one of them was a task in itself, but now with two Man-Eaters at once, it's a real challenge. This is a great fight, but I noticed that the Man-Eaters do suffer from some of the weird behavioral issues that the regular gargoyles do. Thankfully, it does not spoil the fight though, and it's a really intense encounter. So the final part of the Tower of Latria is a very interesting one. After going up a final winding staircase guarded by another Mind Flayer, the final boss of the world is reached, the Old Monk. Except the Old Monk is not like any other boss in the game, because it's not an AI, it's an actual player. So it's not so much a battle with a boss, and more of a test of the player's PvP ability. And I actually think this is one of the most interesting encounters in the entire game if playing in online mode. Of course, since it's a fight against another player, it's subject to the flaws of multiplayer like a myriad of connection issues. It's a really awesome concept though. Use the regular Ice Stone items in this level, but instead of invading a player's world in the regular fashion, become their boss fight. I love it, it's great. Fighting a boss that's using all the items that are also available to the player, and with the intelligence of a real person is really cool. The problem is that this all relies on the host being in online mode. In offline mode, you just fight an AI Black Phantom that isn't nearly as compelling as fighting an actual player. And since the game's servers have now shut down, this part of the game is unfortunately much worse off. Thankfully, there are some private servers being run for the game on PS3 that revive multiplayer functionality, though it's much harder to actually actually have a player to connect with since the player base is dropped. Having a boss like this was such a risky move. Depending on the circumstances, it could easily be one of the best or one of the worst experiences in the entire game for you. The 4th Archstone leads to the Shrine of Storms, a huge island full of ruins, and populated by extremely dangerous skeletons and flying manta ray creatures called Storm Beasts. The skeletons run really fast and dodge your attacks by rolling around. They can deal damage while rolling too, which can make it hard to back away from them as they are constantly rolling towards you. The trick is to actually stay close to them as they'll only start rolling at range. Shields are really useful for blocking their roll attacks. Once they stop rolling, they're not nearly as intimidating. If there's a group of them rolling all over the place, do not panic and run away. They'll only take advantage of that. After those initial skeletons, there's a staircase leading up to a courtyard with some ruined buildings and abandoned battlements. And oh look, it's another fatty vanguard hanging out here. If the fight in the tutorial was lost, then here's a chance to get revenge. Though be wary of the Storm Beasts. They'll fly around and occasionally lob down giant spikes when in range. Remember when I said it was important to have an option to deal range damage? I don't lie about these things. The Storm Beasts don't ever land, so unless they're taken out, they have to be dodged and avoided throughout the entire level, which can be aggravating. Beyond the silver skeletons, some black and gold skeletons also inhabit the ruins. Black skeletons have exceptionally fast lethal attacks, but they can be avoided a bit more easily than the silver skeletons, as they have a long recovery period afterwards. They're heavily armored, so critical attacks like backstabs and ripostes are a much easier way to kill them than just whacking them repeatedly. Now gold skeletons are much slower and don't roll around at all, but they carry huge cleavers that they use to block incoming damage. They're harder to stun and have some attack combos that are really devastating if not avoided, and avoiding them can be pretty hard as they hang out near cliffs and ledges, making it hard to get around them without slipping and falling. I found that luring them out into an area with more space to move around in can be very helpful. A final black skeleton guards the stairs that descend into the level's boss, the Adjudicator. And man, I really don't like this boss at all. And it isn't even a spectacle like the Dragon God, it's just a complete waste of space in my opinion. The whole fight is just attacking his wounds so he kneels down and can get hit in the head. Now the Tower Knight was like this too, but the difference is that the Tower Knight was an actual threat, and even had a whole bunch of crossbowmen with him. The problem with the Adjudicator is that his attacks are so obscenely telegraphed and easily avoidable that the fight is just a complete joke, and it actually didn't have to be. See, the arena has multiple levels. The Adjudicator is at the bottom and the player starts at the top. Fighting him on the staircases and ledges can actually be pretty cool, since his attacks have to actually be avoided. But getting to the ground level just turns him into a complete moron for some reason. And it sucks because fixing the Adjudicator would have been so much easier than fixing the Dragon God. I would have made it so there was no wound to attack that would make him vulnerable. I would have just had melee characters be forced to engage him on the ledges and dodge his attacks, while allowing ranged characters to shoot at him like they already can. Overall, a pretty disappointing fight, and probably the worst boss in the game in my opinion. And it's a shame because it could have been so much better, with just simple changes. The next level takes place further into the island, down in an underground labyrinth, full of reanimated personifications of death, like reapers, ghosts, and the previously encountered skeletons. This is actually a pretty spooky area, like walking into an abandoned tomb and disturbing whatever rests there. There are these long-limbed ghostly creatures that hang out down here. Some shoot out glowing beams, but otherwise they just lash out with their long arms. They can be really intimidating since they're so tall, but if taken out quickly, they can be dealt with. The catch is that they will constantly respawn after being resurrected by a Grim Reaper looking dude. Killing him will desummon all the ghosts in the immediate area. There are also these invisible murderous ones that sneak around. When they're close, they start chuckling from the nether, which can be really creepy. Even further into the tombs, after finding a couple friendly and some not so friendly NPCs, there is this really interesting cave system. Slugs reside in these caves in some gooey liquid. They're pretty easily killed, just don't bunch up next to a group of them. There are also these orbs that fly around in patterns and explode if anything enters close proximity. These caves all lead to the tomb of the next boss, the Old Hero. The Old Hero has a huge aspect to him in that he's actually blind. He has to rely on his other senses to navigate, allowing for a really interesting fight. He can punish a reckless player by finding them pretty easily. It's better to adopt hit and run tactics so that he's always confused as to where to attack, and his attacks are really powerful if they manage to land, which they very well may. He may be blind, but he's a pretty damn good fighter. What's cool is that of course high equip weight can hinder the ability to sneak around him, and if the player is in soul form, they obviously don't have a body that can make noise like footsteps that the old hero can hear. I think that's a really nice touch. It's also possible to wear the thief ring to hinder the old hero's senses even more. While I wouldn't say the old hero is a super easy or super hard fight, he is really fun, and has a cool concept for a boss that makes the fight unique. It also rewards the player's tactics and creativity. The old hero's boss room leads straight out into the next boss, the king of the storm beasts called the Storm King. The Storm King is gargantuan and has a whole army of storm beasts to support him. The fight takes place in an open arena filled with fallen heroes and ruins. Dozens of storm beasts flying all around shoot down their giant stakes. After running around the arena trying to dodge the storm beast attacks, a shiny object is found stuck in the rocks. A great sword with a spiral blade and jagged edges, a relic of an unknown era. This sword, called the Storm Ruler, casts a sky-cutting blade when used, allowing the player a worthy weapon to combat the hordes of beasts. After killing some storm beasts, the Storm King arrives and flies around the arena, blocking out the sun with his size and carpet bombing with projectiles. The Storm Ruler is used as an equalizer to defeat the Storm King. This fight is focused on spectacle like the Dragon God, but the difference is that the keys to defeating the boss are put into the player's hands, instead of just having to activate a button to win. It also helps that the boss has minions and is an actual threat that can deal damage. Though overall, I still prefer more skill-based fights like the Flame Lurker or Man-Eaters. Now, there's a lot of characters in this game, and I could do a video talking about each one, but there's one character in particular that I'd really like to highlight, and I mentioned encountering him earlier in the Tower of Latria. Yurt the Silent Chief, when rescued from his cage, goes back to the Nexus, and makes a little home out of this tucked away corner. He just hangs out there, but eventually, on numerous visits back to the Nexus, something feels wrong. Some of the characters are missing, and a couple dead bodies start showing up around the Nexus. A few of the followers of Saint Urbane are now missing. The mischievous Patches that sells moongrasses is also now gone. Upon discovering this, I went to check out if Yurt was still there. He was, just chilling out, but it reveals that he was responsible for murdering them all, and now his job is to finish off the player. The reason I'm singling out this encounter specifically is because of how well it reflects the world's consistent progression I mentioned before. Characters have their own agendas and do their own thing, and I think it's awesome how Yurt was able to shatter the previously thought sanctity of the Nexus. It's like the game subtly hinting that nowhere is safe, not even in the Nexus, which has been used as the only safe haven from the rest of the game. In fact, if a pure black character tendency is achieved, a character named Mephistopheles will appear if Yurt is killed, and will give out assassination quests, where the task is to go out and hunt down other side characters in the game. I said earlier that the tendency system is a bit confusing, and it can be a bit finicky getting it to work favorably, but when it does work, it rewards the player with new quest lines and interactions like this, that can add an additional layer of depth and replayability to the experience. The fifth and final archstone leads to the Valley of Defilement, a pit full of decrepit creatures corrupted by disease and decay, with constant rain and darkness covering it all. The people here aren't very nice, to put it lightly. The whole place is full of diseased, depraved ones, rats, and giant ticks, all of which don't take too kindly to any intruders in their habitats. Going through the Valley of Defilement feels like navigating a jungle. It starts up in a primitive-looking tribal settlement inhabited by the depraved ones. They're really weak in terms of health, but they behave erratically. Their unpredictable nature makes them a pretty sizable threat, especially in numbers. Most of them wield knives and try to shiv anyone that comes near them. Some carry flaming pole spears that shouldn't be underestimated. There are some that can cast a poison cloud spell as well. What really poses a threat, though, are the giant depraved ones, which have way more health and deal way more damage that can be hard to avoid. Getting caught between a group of normal ones and the big one can lead to a frantic situation, trying to dodge attacks from every direction. There are also these rats that are found in one of the rooms. Getting bit by them isn't very ideal because they carry the plague. If the plague is caught, it can only be cured by using a rare healing item. Other creatures can be found here, like a couple giant ticks that spray poisonous liquid when popped. That can be avoided by hitting them from a distance. Staying too close to them when they pop will definitely hurt. Poisoning is another status effect that can be cured with an item, just like the plague. This all leads to the boss fight against the Leechmonger, a huge monster covered in worms and leeches. It can shoot out leeches which cover the player, impeding movement and draining health. The leeches can also crawl back onto the Leechmonger and heal it over time. This is overall a moderately easy fight. It just requires dealing a lot of damage in a small amount of time. He's also very weak to fire, so that's an easy tactic to take this boss down. And that's it really, it's not much to write home about. I think this boss is somewhat unmemorable because it doesn't have many very hard-hitting attacks to really punish the player. It does have a creepy disgust factor though with the visuals. The next level after the Leechmonger is defeated is actually down at the bottom of the valley. The whole place is a giant swamp full of poisonous liquid that has to be traversed. Getting poisoned is absolutely guaranteed down here, meaning the health bar is going to be constantly choking. The Regenerator's Ring is really useful here, as it will slowly raise the health bar as the poison is slowly lowering it. Make sure to have a lot of moongrasses because this level is basically a battle against a constantly decreasing health bar, and the creatures that live down here only add to the odds. Squads of depraved ones roam around, sometimes multiple giant ones. Poison jellies block paths, giant predator mosquitoes roam around, and the slugs from the Shrine of Storms are also here, in much greater numbers. This level is a prime example of a great dilemma that will be encountered when playing this game, and that's whether to continue on and push forward, or to fall back to the Nexus. Remember, upon death, all souls are dropped in a bloodstain, and there's one chance to pick it back up before it's gone forever. Going through a dangerous level like this one can be a really bad time if there are a lot of souls in the bank. Sometimes overconfidence will strike, and you'll think it's a good idea to push forward with thousands of souls and end up losing them forever. As with most of the game, being patient yields its rewards. Sometimes turning back and returning to the Nexus is the best idea. After going through the poison swamp, there are some more primitive wood settlements inhabited by a bunch of depraved ones. That'll lead to the next boss, the Dirty Colossus. He's really weak to fire, just like the Leechmonger, and shoots out flies to cover you and deal damage just like the leeches. And again, this boss isn't too much of a big deal. It's actually an even less memorable fight than the Leechmonger. Both of them are filler bosses in my opinion. It's kind of a shame too, because I think the Valley of Defilement is a pretty well done world otherwise, especially when you consider the next boss, which is right after beating the Dirty Colossus. Stepping through the final fog wall in the Valley of Defilement leads to the Sanctuary of Maiden Estrella, a saint who set out on a pilgrimage to the Valley of Defilement in order to help the people suffering there. She has the soul of a demon and is guarded by her faithful bodyguard Garl Vinland. Garl Vinland is the real boss here, as Maiden Estrella is mostly defenseless without him. The boss room is full of depraved ones helplessly praying to her. They aren't hostile and don't attack even if provoked. Maiden Estrella is reached after going down a narrow passageway to the left, which Garl Vinland stops the player at. He will meet you halfway and try to prevent you from reaching Maiden Estrella. He is an absolute tank, wielding a giant hammer that deals a ton of damage. You have to fight him very carefully because he'll body you in 1 or 2 hits. Interestingly, he doesn't chase the player if lured away from Maiden Estrella. His dedication to protecting her is pretty solid. All the while fighting Garl Vinland to reach Maiden Estrella, they both berate you with comments about how much of an a-hole you are for coming to kill them. And they're right, I mean they're just chilling here trying to help these people, and you're murdering them for a demon soul. It's pretty messed up. After killing Garl Vinland, Maiden Estrella just resigns to her fate and commits suicide, allowing the player to take the demon soul. The music during this fight is some of the best in the entire game. It creates a depressing atmosphere as 2 innocent people are killed for no good reason. Their god abandoned them in the deepest depths of the swamp, and the player has to finish them off. I think it's a testament to the game's storytelling in this scenario that I felt so bad for killing them even though I never even met them before. By killing demons, the player has become a monster himself. I think this is actually my favorite encounter in the entire game, because of how hard-hitting it was when I first played it. So now that I've gone through the 5 worlds, I want to talk about something I actually just realized about this game, and it's that it actually has a pretty strong horror theme. Now I don't mean that the game is actively trying to scare the player, but it definitely tries to create a horror atmosphere with its aesthetics. If I think back to the prison in the Tower of Latria, it reminds me a lot of torture and blood horror, you know, like Hellraiser with all the spikes and pools of blood everywhere. And in regards to the level with gargoyles, that's pretty obviously a Fear of the Dark type thing. Then in the Shrine of Storms, you have the whole level leading up to the Old Hero, which is a supernatural horror theme in the underground tombs, sort of like a haunted house horror theme as well. And finally, in the Valley of Defilement, you have body horror with all the diseased, decayed, fleshy creatures, and a bunch of bugs, which all invade the body, definitely trying to provoke a feeling of disgust. Yeah, I just wanted to share that. I think it's really cool. I actually really like it when non-horror games have horror themes. The game doesn't really have to be scary for it to have cool horror-inspired settings, which Demon's Souls has 3 of. Alright, I shared something I thought was cool. Now I'm going to share something that infuriates me to no end, and that is the inventory burden system. The equipment burden is fine, works perfectly, but the inventory burden is just terrible. And that's because when your inventory is full and you pick up something you can't carry, you are forced to drop it. The problem here is that items dropped by the player are permanently lost when the level is reloaded. This can cause you to lose out on certain items if you're not going and dropping things off at Stockpile Thomas back in the Nexus. It sucks too because you don't know what an item is before going to pick it up. You discover what it is when picking it up, so you can't just leave it alone if you know it's going to be too heavy for your inventory. It's just straight up bad design, and the easy fix is to either just have the inventory limit removed, or don't have dropped items be permanently deleted when leaving the level. So that's the other 4 worlds completed, but now there's still 2 more levels in the Boletarian Palace to complete in order to finish the game. The first is accessed from the giant fog wall after the Tower Knight that blocked passage earlier. An Archdemon, which is the final boss in any of the other worlds, has to be defeated in order to unlock the door, so it's possible to reach this area much earlier. When the door is opened, one of the fat officials is there with his creepy grin and runs away. He goes around and sort of orchestrates the remaining King's Men to ambush you throughout the level. You can kill a couple of them around the level, which is pretty satisfying when you finally track them down. There are more dog enemies from the dragon-infested bridges previously, and they're as vicious as usual. Evading their attacks can be pretty hard since they're hard to read. I usually just use a shield to block them. A whole bunch of Boletaria soldiers and Red Eye Knights are in this level as well, but a new enemy is introduced here, the Imperial Spy. They're sort of stealthy rogues that use even better ambush tactics than the other soldiers. They wear dark clothing and are pretty slim, making them camouflage into the environment very well. They're pretty squishy though, so the main challenge is just detecting them and dodging their throwing daggers. You can also meet some of the same NPCs from the previous levels in the Boletarian Palace, like Ostrava, and they're just continuing on their quests as I am mine. Ostrava reveals his quest. He's trying to find his father, the King of Boletaria. Again, I want to say how cool of a feeling that is. I love how all the characters are all doing their own things around the levels as you progress through the game. They all have their own unique motives and storylines. It would honestly take me several videos to talk about them all, so I won't. For now, anyway. And another thing is that none of these quests are marked in any log. There's basically zero handholding in Demon Souls. It's a game that just drops you into its world with zero help, besides being taught the controls in the tutorial. The game reveals its workings to you as you play it. You have time to take it all in and appreciate the little details, and it makes it all the more worthwhile to replay the game so you can find all the things you missed the last time around. Hell, even I on this playthrough missed so many things, or omitted certain things that I could have shown in the video. Like I said, talking about all of it would require a lot of time. I want to keep this video in a digestible format so it doesn't end up being multiple hours long. So after going up a staircase guarded by a bunch of Red Eye Knights, we reach the next boss. Now that's one hell of an entrance. This guy is called the Penetrator because, well, just look. Yeah, I think it's safe to say this guy is kind of a badass. He's got like the coolest looking armor out of anyone in the game. Actually, his aesthetic reminds me a lot of Japanese mechs or Transformers. He swings around his extremely long sword that has bleed through damage even if blocked. It's got these cool teal streaks that follow it around as well. The boss room is full of statues that he can easily destroy with a single hit, so they're not ideal for hiding behind. This fight is one of the coolest in the game because it's like I'm fighting a full-on armor-clad knight in a duel to the death. And fighting him is really fun as well. He's got this stance that's sort of like a hybrid between a knight and a samurai, and his sword blows are really impactful and hard-hitting. Overall, I think the Penetrator is up there with a Flame Lurker and Man-Eaters as my top 3 bosses in the whole game. To me, it's all about how fun it is to actually fight the boss. Difficulty certainly plays into that, but the moment-to-moment combat while fighting the boss has to be fun for it to be one of my favorites, and the Penetrator definitely excels at that. Fighting him makes me feel awesome because he's awesome. His moves and skills are great, and the player has to match his in order to stand a chance and win. Alright, so we're at the final level. What lies ahead is basically the run to the final boss. There are soldiers, Red Eye Knights, fat officials, and spies along the way, but the real threat is the blue dragon going around and incinerating anything in its path. It will guard the paths leading to the final boss, and its fog wall as well. This area mostly serves as a gauntlet you have to run every time you die against the final boss. On the steps leading up to the final boss, Ostrava is here once again. He tells you that his father, the king, has become a demon. Ostrava gives you a key to the Boletaria Mausoleum, and says that inside lies his father's 2 swords, Demon Brand and Soul Brand. He then pleads that you put an end to this madness and dies. I can't actually tell if he commits suicide or dies of injuries sustained throughout the game, but essentially he's lost the will to live because his quest is now forfeit. Inside the mausoleum you find old King Duran, an ancient demigod locked away by the king. He is the original founder of Boletaria and guards one of the kingdom's most holy treasures, the sword Demon Brand. In order to retrieve the sword, Duran will ask you to prove your worth and defeat him in a duel. You don't actually have to kill him, just take his health down a sizable chunk to prove your skills. When that's done, he'll give you Demon Brand. The sword has a unique property where it becomes more powerful the higher your character tendency is. And hey, I'd say that's a pretty sweet reward for following Ostrava's quest. Alright, so it's time to fight the final boss, the Old King Allant. He's chilling there looking over his destroyed kingdom. Kinda screwed up that he's just letting it all happen. He comes to face you, and a duel to the death begins. He has a very composed stance, but his attacks are really swift. He can pull off multiple hit combos that can be really hard to evade. Some of his swings shoot out a magic arc that will deal additional damage. It's best not to dodge backwards from his attacks, or you'll end up having to avoid 2 hits. If you dodge sideways, the magic rays have a harder time hitting you. He has a really powerful move where he leaps into the air for a plunging attack. If you panic and dodge too early, you'll get caught in it. Another thing is that he will plunge his sword into the ground and let out a huge shockwave that will one-shot anything around him. You can try and run away from it, but if caught in the corner, a better option is to run up to attack him, to stun him and break his charge up. I think the main challenge from this boss comes from how much you can make the player panic. His moves are either very telegraphed or not at all, so it can be hard to know exactly when to dodge. And when he catches you while dodging, it can cause even more panic as you try to recover. The best strategy against this guy is just to keep your composure. So as a final boss, I think King Allant does a good job at testing the player's skill. After defeating the Old King Allant, a voice is heard, the king's actual voice. The thing you just fought was a demonic falsehood. So the Archstone leads back to the Nexus, and the statue's sword drops down and shatters a hole in the glass floor. The endgame zone is a beach with some ruins, and nearby is the massive Old One, an ancient demonic entity responsible for all this. The Maiden in Black leads you down into the lair of the Old One. King Allant says that you've been chosen by the Old One, and you can seek everlasting demon souls with him, or you can defeat the Old One once and for all. You pass through a final fog wall and are presented with the real King Allant, now a wriggling mass of decrepitude. He says that God created the Old One to put an end to the painfulness of existence. After finally killing King Allant, he says that no one wishes to go on, and drops his sword, the Soul Brand, which has the opposite effect of Demon Brand, getting more powerful the lower your character tendency is. So now the job is done, the Maiden in Black can put the Old One to sleep, and you'll no longer be trapped within the Nexus. So now you actually have 2 choices. You can leave and let the Maiden in Black do her job, lull the Old One back to sleep, while you go out and become the world's new godlike protector. Alternatively, you can actually kill the Maiden in Black and become a demonic servant of the Old One. There's a theory that the good ending leads to Bloodborne and the bad ending leads to Dark Souls, but I think that's a bit of a stretch. After beating the game, you wake up back in the Nexus for a New Game Plus run. You get to keep all the levels and items you gained in the previous run, but key items are taken away from you. And you can play through the game again with tougher enemies, make different choices, invest in different stats, whatever you want. New Game Plus is a great feature, but I usually prefer to just start a new fresh save if I want to play the game again. Of course, multiple New Game Pluses compound on each other after you keep beating the game over and over, with the enemies being even tougher every time, effectively raising the difficulty of the game, which is great for experienced players as they'll have a greater challenge. So I obviously didn't cover everything in the game, like how after getting Demon Brand and Soul Brand, you can combine them in New Game Plus into a sword that has the benefits of both, or you know, all the different magic spells, weapons, and armors in the game. But I think overall I talked about everything I wanted to. Demon Souls is a great action RPG experience that's an absolute blast to play through every time. You start off as an unskilled noob, anxiously dipping your toes into it, and after a while you become hooked, addicted to the high risk, high reward gameplay. Even when you master the game, it still keeps you on your toes. You enter a psychological flow with the gameplay that keeps it challenging and fun at the same time. The game itself teaches you how to play it well through the design of the enemies and the levels. Most of the game is just uninterrupted gameplay, where you're exploring the game and braving its challenges at your own pace. And I think that's what Demon Souls' gameplay does best. It never ceases challenging the player, so even when you master it, the game can still be entertaining without being boring. So I'll probably do a video on each of the Souls games, but I thought it was important to do Demon Souls first. Besides the reason of it being the first Souls game, I think it's a very underrated game compared to Dark Souls, and understandably so. Dark Souls had an extremely popular multi-platform release on PlayStation, Xbox, and PC, while Demon Souls remains a PS3 exclusive, and for that reason alone it's much more niche than the other Souls games. It's kind of a shame too, since a lot of the great things attributed to Dark Souls were actually done first in Demon Souls. I definitely think this game needs way more exposure than it currently has. I mean, of course people are aware of it now more than ever because it's now part of a widely successful series, but it's just less accessible to people, since it's exclusive to a console that's no longer supported. And for that reason, the game is kind of being lost to time. It's in desperate need of a port to newer consoles and to the PC as well. I definitely recommend that you play Demon Souls if you haven't, especially if you're a fan of the Souls series who hasn't played it yet. If you have a good computer, just go get the RPCS3 emulator and have at it. If you don't, then I'd recommend picking up a PS3. They're pretty cheap nowadays anyway. Anyway, so that's Demon Souls. I hope you had a good time watching this video. Let me know your thoughts on Demon Souls down in the comments below. It's been Alan, and until next time, thanks for watching. Peace.